The woods behind my house had always been a source of comfort for me, a place where I could escape the stresses of daily life and lose myself in nature. Ever since I was a child, I'd spent countless hours wandering through the dense trees, exploring hidden paths, and marveling at the untouched wilderness. It was my sanctuary, a place that felt like it was mine and mine alone. When I bought the house a few years ago, one of the main reasons I chose it was because of its proximity to the woods. The backyard sloped down to a thick line of trees that seemed to stretch on forever, an inviting sea of leaves and shadows. I built a small deck out back where I would sit in the evenings, listening to the rustling leaves and the distant calls of birds as the sun set behind the trees. For years, the woods were just that, an idyllic retreat where I could disconnect from the world. But then, one autumn evening, something changed. Something shifted in those woods, and they were never the same again. It started subtly, with a chill in the air more intense than the usual autumn breeze. The leaves had just begun to change, creating a breathtaking tapestry against the deepening blue of the evening sky. I remember sitting on the deck, sipping tea, the warmth of the mug seeping into my hands as I watched the sun dip below the horizon. As the light faded, the woods grew darker, the shadows lengthening. The familiar shapes of trees became more obscure. I was used to nightfall in the woods, but that evening, the darkness felt different, denser somehow, pressing in on me. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the changing season playing tricks on my mind. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the trees, a flash of something pale against the dark trunks. I turned quickly, straining to see through the gathering gloom, but whatever I had seen was gone. The woods were still again, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a trick of the light and tried to push the incident out of my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to the woods, to that fleeting glimpse of movement, that sense of something lurking in the shadows. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd spent too much time alone and was letting my imagination get the best of me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't convince myself that everything was normal. The next day, I decided to go for a walk in the woods, hoping that being out there in the daylight would ease my mind. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, following one of the familiar paths winding through the trees. The sun was shining, the air crisp and cool, the woods alive with birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of what I had seen the night before, but everything seemed normal, peaceful even. The woods were as they had always been, a place of tranquility and solitude. I began to relax, convincing myself that I had indeed imagined the whole thing. But then, as I rounded a bend in the path, I saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs and a pale, almost translucent skin. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my mind racing. Was it a person? An animal? But no, it couldn't be. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. I took a step back, instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity, a need to understand what I was seeing. Then, slowly, it began to move. It stepped out from behind the trees, its movements slow and deliberate, as if testing the ground before it. The light filtering through the trees cast eerie shadows across its body, giving it an almost ethereal appearance. But the closer it got, the more real it became and the more my fear grew. It was tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, its fingers ending in sharp, claw-like tips. Its face was pale, almost featureless, with deep-set, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into me. For a moment, I was paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to think. But then, as it drew closer, something inside me snapped, and I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like an eternity. The trees blurred past me, the path a twisting, turning nightmare as I stumbled and tripped over roots and rocks. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Finally, I burst out of the woods and into my backyard, collapsing onto the grass, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I lay there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind, couldn't forget the way it had looked at me with those hollow, empty eyes. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there, just beyond the trees, waiting for me. I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn, but the sense of unease, of being watched, never left me. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid the woods, staying inside as much as possible. But it was impossible to ignore the constant pull, the nagging curiosity that kept me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to return. And then one night it came back. It was late, and I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard it, a soft rustling outside, like something moving through the leaves. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got up slowly, my heart pounding, and walked to the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something moving just beyond them. Something tall and thin, its shadow stretching across the yard. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the rising tide of fear, and slowly reached for the curtain. My hand trembled as I gripped the fabric, hesitating for a moment before pulling it back. And there it was. It stood at the edge of the woods, just beyond the line of trees, its pale skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was watching me, those hollow eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The world seemed to shrink, the air heavy and thick, pressing down on me from all sides. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed by fear, trapped in its gaze. Finally, I forced myself to step back from the window, pulling the curtain shut with trembling hands. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But nothing made sense anymore. I locked all the doors, checked all the windows, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. That night, I barely slept, my mind plagued by nightmares of pale figures with hollow eyes, their long, thin fingers reaching out for me from the darkness. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside sent my heart racing, my mind conjuring images of that figure standing just outside, watching, waiting. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's place in the city, hoping that getting away would help clear my mind, help me forget what I had seen. But even there, in the safety of the city, I couldn't escape the memories. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there, just beyond the trees, its hollow eyes staring back at me. I began to dread the night, the darkness, the silence. Felt like it was following me, even into my dreams. After a few days, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to know if it was still there, if it was real, or if I had imagined the whole thing. I returned to the house late in the afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The woods stood silent and still, the leaves barely moving in the breeze. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that everything was normal, that I had just let my imagination get the best of me. But then, as I stepped out of the car, I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the woods, just where it had been the night before, its pale skin glowing in the fading light. It was watching me, waiting. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. But this time I didn't run. Couldn't. Something inside me told me that running wouldn't help, that it would only make things worse. I took a deep breath and slowly walked toward it, my legs trembling with each step. The closer I got, the more real it became, until I was standing just a few feet away, staring into those hollow, empty eyes. For a long moment, we just stood there, staring at each other, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I wanted to speak, to ask it what it wanted, why it was here, but the words caught in my throat. Then, slowly, it raised one long, thin finger and pointed at me. I felt a chill run down my spine, a deep, primal fear I couldn't explain. Before I could react, before I could even comprehend what was happening, it turned and disappeared into the woods, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where it had vanished, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing made sense anymore. The world I had known, the peaceful woods that had once been my sanctuary, were gone, replaced by something dark and twisted, something I couldn't understand. I never saw it again after that night, but the memory of those hollow eyes, that pale, featureless face, haunts me to this day. I sold the house soon after, moving far away, trying to put as much distance between myself and those woods as possible. But no matter where I go, I can't escape the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting. And sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness closes in, I swear I can feel those hollow eyes on me, staring, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. I had always been a bit of an adventurer, seeking out the forgotten corners of the world and chasing the thrill of discovering hidden places. So, when my friend Lucy told me about the old house on the outskirts of town, it was only natural that my curiosity was piqued. Lucy had heard rumors about the house being haunted, and she insisted that it was the perfect spot for a thrilling adventure. The house had stood empty for decades, a relic from a time long past. It was located at the end of a long, overgrown driveway that was barely visible through the tangled underbrush. The stories about it were varied. Some said it was abandoned after a family tragedy, while others claimed it had been cursed. But all accounts agreed on one thing: the house was abandoned, and no one had lived there for years. On a crisp autumn afternoon, with the sun hanging low in the sky and casting long shadows, Lucy and I decided to explore the house. We parked the car at the edge of the overgrown driveway and made our way through the tangled foliage. The house loomed ahead, partially obscured by the thick vegetation. It was a large, two-story Victorian with a sagging roof and broken windows, giving it an air of eerie desolation. As we approached, the first thing that struck me was the silence, an unsettling silence, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our feet and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. Lucy and I exchanged glances, both feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. The front porch was covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, and the door hung slightly ajar. We hesitated for a moment, our hearts racing, before pushing the door open with a creak. The interior was dark, with only slivers of light penetrating through the boarded-up windows. The air was musty and heavy, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. The house was filled with old, decaying furniture. Dust-covered chairs, sagging sofas, and faded wallpaper peeling away from the walls. It was clear that no one had been here for a long time. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of abandonment and neglect, pressing down on us like a heavy shroud. As we explored the ground floor, we found old photographs and personal belongings scattered about. It was like stepping back in time, seeing remnants of a family's life frozen in decay. There were old family portraits, their faces obscured by grime, yellowed newspapers with headlines from decades past, and dusty trinkets that once held sentimental value, now forgotten. Upstairs, the house was even more disheveled. The floorboards creaked ominously under our weight, and the rooms were filled with broken furniture and cobwebs that hung like ghostly curtains. We found a door at the end of the hallway that was slightly ajar, revealing a room that seemed different from the others. The air felt colder as we approached, an inexplicable sense of foreboding settling over us. Inside the room, we found a small, dusty bed with an old quilt draped over it. Strangely, this room was well preserved compared to the rest of the house. On the nightstand was a small, ornate box, its surface covered in intricate carvings. Lucy picked up the box and examined it, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Look at this," she said, holding it up. "It's beautiful. I wonder if there's something inside." I nodded, intrigued. Lucy carefully opened the box, revealing a collection of old letters and a small locket. The letters were yellowed with age, tied together with a faded ribbon. As Lucy untied the ribbon and began to read the letters aloud, I felt an unsettling chill in the room. The letters were written in an elegant script, filled with personal details and emotional expressions. They were clearly from someone named Eleanor, and they spoke of love, loss, and longing. But as Lucy read, I noticed something odd. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive weight. A shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Suddenly, we heard a noise, a faint, sorrowful sound coming from somewhere in the house. It was a soft, mournful melody, like a piano playing a haunting tune. We exchanged worried glances, and Lucy quickly shut the box, her curiosity giving way to unease. "We should get out of here," I said, my voice tinged with urgency. "This place is giving me the creeps." Lucy nodded, her face pale. We made our way back downstairs, the eerie melody continuing to echo through the house. The feeling of being watched intensified, and every creak and groan of the house seemed magnified in the oppressive silence. As we reached the front door, the melody grew louder and more discordant, as if the house itself was reacting to our presence, its sorrowful music becoming more frantic. We hurried out, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. We took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. Lucy looked back at the house, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't think we should come back here," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong with this place." I agreed, feeling a sense of relief as we drove away from the house. The further we got, the more the oppressive feeling seemed to lift. We talked about the house and our experience, trying to make sense of what we had encountered. But no matter how much we talked, the sense of unease lingered. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to return to the house alone, hoping to find some answers. I approached the house with a mix of trepidation and determination. The sun was high in the sky, casting a bright light over the property, and I hoped that daylight would dispel some of the lingering fears. As I entered the house again, the atmosphere was different. The oppressive weight I had felt before seemed to have lifted, and the house was eerily quiet. I carefully made my way back to the room with the ornate box, feeling a sense of déjà vu. The box was still on the nightstand, just as we had left it. I picked it up and opened it, examining the letters and locket once more. The letters were still filled with the same emotional expressions, but now they seemed almost melancholic rather than unsettling. As I read through the letters, I noticed a small handwritten note tucked inside. It was a short message, written in a different hand than the rest of the letters. The note read, "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. I never meant for it to end like this. Please forgive me." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the note. It was as if the house was trying to communicate something to me, to convey a message of regret and sorrow. The melody I had heard before began again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. I took the box and the letters and left the house, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. It was clear that the house held a story of sorrow and longing, a story still lingering in its empty rooms. The house had its secrets, and while I might never fully understand them, I felt that I had glimpsed a part of its troubled past. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the property. The house stood silent and still, its secrets hidden within its decaying walls. I knew I would never return, but the memory of the forgotten house and its sorrowful melody would stay with me. The experience had left me with a sense of melancholy, a reminder of the stories and emotions that can linger long after the people who created them have gone. The forgotten house had revealed its haunted past, and I had been a witness to its lingering sorrow. It remained a mystery, a chilling reminder of the hidden stories and unspoken regrets that can linger long after the physical remnants have faded away. It was a chilly October afternoon when I first stumbled upon the toy store. I had been wandering around the old part of town, searching for a cozy cafe to settle down in, when I noticed a quaint little shop with a faded sign that read, "Toys and Trinkets." The shop front was small, but the window display was charming, filled with an assortment of vintage toys and trinkets that seemed to whisper of a bygone era. I couldn't resist the pull of nostalgia and curiosity, so I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, greeted by the warm, musty scent of old wood and polished metal. The shop was packed with an eclectic mix of items: wooden dolls, tin cars, porcelain figurines, and more. The walls were lined with shelves, and the floor was cluttered with boxes and stacks of old games and toys. As I wandered through the narrow aisles, I found myself drawn to a dusty corner of the shop where an old rocking horse stood. It was beautifully crafted, with a rich mahogany finish and a carved mane and tail. It looked like it had been well loved in its time, but now it was worn and covered in a thin layer of dust. Despite its age, it exuded a strange, unsettling presence that I couldn't quite place. I was about to move on when a small, unassuming wooden box on a lower shelf caught my eye. It was intricately carved with delicate patterns, and a small, tarnished brass latch secured it shut. Curious, I opened the box and inside I found a collection of old, worn-out toys, a couple of tin soldiers, a set of miniature wooden animals, and a small, intricately designed music box. But it was the last item that truly captured my attention. A rag doll. Its once bright colors were faded, and its stitching was coming undone. The doll's face was almost featureless, with just a pair of small black beads for eyes and a stitched mouth that curled into a permanent, unsettling grin. Its clothes were tattered, and its yarn hair was matted and tangled. There was something about the doll that sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I asked the shopkeeper about the doll, but he only gave me a vague answer. He said it was an old toy with an interesting history, but didn't go into any details. Despite my unease, I found myself drawn to it and decided to buy the entire box of toys. The shopkeeper wrapped them up carefully and handed them to me, and I left the store with a mix of excitement and apprehension. When I got home, I set the box down on the living room floor and began to sort through its contents. Most of the toys were charming in their own way, and I felt a pang of nostalgia as I examined them. But the rag doll remained the most disturbing. I couldn't shake the feeling that its bead eyes were following me, that its stitched grin was somehow mocking me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. I was restless, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling of unease. Finally, I decided to get up and take another look at it. I brought the doll into the bedroom and placed it on a chair near the bed, thinking that perhaps seeing it up close might help me understand why it was bothering me so much. As I lay in bed, staring at the doll in the dim light, I noticed something strange. The grin on the doll's face seemed to shift, as if it were slowly changing shape. I blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but the grin remained unsettlingly wide. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. Eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep, only to be woken in the middle of the night by a strange noise. It was a faint rhythmic thumping sound coming from the direction of the living room. I listened intently, trying to identify the source of the noise, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. I got up and made my way to the living room, the thumping growing louder with each step. When I entered the room, I saw that the rag doll was no longer on the chair. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the room, looking for any sign of where it might have gone. Then I heard it again, the thumping, coming from the direction of the box. I flicked on the light, and there it was, the doll sitting in the middle of the floor, its grin even wider than before. The rhythmic thumping was coming from the doll itself, as if it were somehow moving on its own. I knelt down, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and noticed that the doll's eyes seemed to be moving, shifting as if they were following me. I picked up the doll and placed it back in the box, hoping that closing the lid would stop the unsettling noises. But the thumping continued, growing louder and more erratic. I felt a wave of panic rise within me and decided to remove the doll from the house entirely. I grabbed the box and took it outside, setting it down in the backyard. I felt a sense of relief as I watched the box disappear into the darkness. I went back inside, locking the doors and windows, and tried to calm myself down. I was exhausted and shaken, but I finally managed to get some sleep. The next morning, I awoke feeling somewhat better. I decided to check on the box, thinking that perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. But when I went outside, I found the box exactly where I had left it. The lid was still closed, and there were no signs of anything unusual. I brought the box back inside, thinking that maybe I had been overly tired and that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the night's events. I started to sort through the toys again, but the rag doll was missing. It wasn't in the box, and there was no sign of it anywhere. As the days went by, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I began to notice strange things happening around the house. Objects moving on their own, eerie sounds at night, and a constant sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread only intensified. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a faint familiar sound, the rhythmic thumping. It was coming from the living room again, and was accompanied by a soft, mechanical melody. I got up, my heart pounding, and made my way to the source of the noise. When I entered the living room, I saw the rag doll sitting on the coffee table, its grin even wider than before. The music box that had originally been in the wooden box was playing a hauntingly familiar tune, and the thumping sound was coming from the doll itself. I tried to pick up the doll, but it felt oddly heavy, as if it were resisting my touch. The thumping grew louder and more insistent, and I could see the doll's eyes moving, tracking my every movement. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the music grew more frantic, the melody twisting into a discordant, nightmarish tune. In a panic, I grabbed the doll and threw it into the fireplace, hoping that destroying it would end the torment. The doll's eyes seemed to widen in terror as it was consumed by the flames, and the thumping noise grew louder and more frantic until it suddenly stopped. I watched as the doll burned, the flames crackling and dancing around it. When the fire finally died down, I was left with a pile of ash and soot. The music had stopped, and the house was eerily quiet. The following day, I cleaned up the remnants of the doll and tried to go on with my life, but the sense of unease never fully left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Strange things continued to happen around the house. Doors opening on their own, objects moving, and a constant feeling of being watched. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft, familiar tune. The music from the music box. It was faint, almost like a distant memory, but unmistakable. I got up and searched the house, but I couldn't find the source of the music. As I lay back in bed, trying to calm my racing heart, I noticed something on the floor. A small wooden box identical to the one I had bought from the toy store. It was sitting at the foot of the bed, its brass latch glinting in the dim light. With trembling hands, I opened the box and inside I found the rag doll, its grin just as unsettling as before. The music box was there too, playing the haunting melody. I don't know how it got there, but I knew one thing for sure. I could never escape it. The doll had somehow found its way back to me, and the torment was far from over. The feeling of dread was now a constant companion, a reminder of the malevolent presence that lurked just out of sight. I moved to a new place shortly after leaving the old apartment and its haunted past behind. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the doll is still out there, waiting for me, watching from the shadows. The cursed toy remains a chilling memory, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most innocent of objects. Though I try to put the past behind me, I know that the fear will never truly leave me, that the rag doll and its haunting melody will always be with me.